thanks to all of you for coming and to everyone who joins us in Zoom as well. I'm very excited to be able to be here and talk to you today, and you'll actually be hearing a bit both about the research that I did for my PhD and what I'm doing now for my postdoc and the current research funding. Just check that this can flip. Yes. Yeah, so I will talk to you today about the type of research that I'm doing, and specifically to try and give you a small insight into what network science can be used for by Egyptologists. So I titled this Bringing the Past to Life with Ancient Texts and Network Science, because I want to try and show you how I try to get into the very details of what we can learn about life from written sources from ancient Egypt, with using methods of network science and specifically of social network analysis to be able to do so. So I thought I would start today with just giving an example of a document, just to give you an impression of the sort of details that I'm very interested in. So we'll actually have a look at the one that you see here on the front slide, where you see the papyrus, and then you see a network graph representing this particular text. So if we look at this in translation, so this is the translation by Pestman. It's a letter regarding the shipment of cloth to be used for mattresses. And the text reads, Eudemos, the agent of Demetrius the Oikonomos, and Heraclides, the agent of Dionysius the Antigraphus, to Hegemon and Philos, greetings. Heraclides has brought down from Naucratis to the Emporium the 9 webs of Soroya cloth for the wrapping of mattresses that he received from Hermodoros, the agent of Demetrius. Farewell, year 27, Koyak 3. So this is a letter that was written on 27th of January, 258 BC. And it gives us several details about specific individuals involved in specific activities, how things are brought from one place to another and who is involved with this, and a bit on the relations. So what I want to talk to you about today, and I should mention also, of course, that I'm Norwegian, so you're very welcome to ask me questions in Swedish as well, but I'm afraid I can't communicate in Finnish. So I'll speak in English, and I'll try to remember to speak a bit slow and try to speak extra clearly, but do stop me at any time if it's unclear or if I get too excited and I speak too fast. Just tell me to slow down and relax, and I'll try to do that. So I want to talk to you today first on what I am using these sort of written sources for. What are the texts that I'm interested in and what am I hoping to do with them? But talking then a bit about the theories and how I approach them and from what perspective I try to look at these ancient texts. I will speak to you about how I do it, so to give you an insight in how you can go about using methods of network science for the study of these sort of texts. And then hopefully you will, at the end of this talk, have at least some idea of the type of research that this method and these materials, the mix of those can do too. So if we start with the sort of things that I want to know, through my studies as well, I was always very interested in trying to get closer to the question of what it was like to live in ancient Egypt. And I was always particularly interested in learning how this was for the people that were not the royalties and not the very, very high elite, but to try and get closer to what life would have been like for the commoners, the women, the children, and basically the voices that we don't hear so often in the text and are more difficult to grasp. So I always looked for methods that kind of allowed me to look at the data in a way that some of these silent voices or very quiet voices are heard more. So I'm interested in human behaviors to see how people of the past would behave and how they would behave in different situations and towards different people, but also how they are then linked to different institutions that they are acting with in their life as well. So I'm interested in structures, both social structures, but also then the link between humans and institutions, places, objects, and so on. So yeah, studying different sorts of boundaries, basically. And in order to do these sort of things, to do this type of research, I'm basically looking at the material from a relational perspective. So in addition to being interested in the women and the men and what they are doing and such, I'm interested in how they relate to one another and how those relationships affect what they do and who they are and the opportunities they have and so on. So with this relational perspective, I basically look at the evidence. So what I will talk about today is mostly written sources, but I'm also trying to link this up with archaeological data whenever that's possible. But then to look at the material that was left from ancient Egypt and build network data from that. So extract information on how different entities relate to one another and structure that as network models. And this is what I will show you today, how I'm doing that. But yeah, this is sort of the background and the framework. So just to show you this example here, this is just to try and start to see what network science and network models do. So basically when we use that for historical or archaeological research, we have a past phenomena. And then we need, in order to study that, we need to abstract that somehow. So we can abstract that with network concepts. And then in order to study that, we need to represent that network concepts with network data. And this is what kind of builds up the network model. So the example that was given in this publication by Collar, down in the corner here, you have the reference for the article that used this figure. And the example that they use is trade between individuals as a past concept or past phenomenon. If you are interested in looking at trade, you can abstract that by thinking that social entities interact and there's a flow of goods that happen between these. In the representation, you can then do these sort of network graphs where you make dots that represent individuals. This could also be cities, for example, or institutions. And then you have lines representing the flow of goods that happen between these. So if we again look at this is the same letter that we read before. This actually fits very nicely into this framework as an example as well. Because if we color this so that we see the people here in light pink, you have places in purple, and you have objects that are being shipped, or details on what is being transported in, I think it's supposed to be brown at least. So you have a lot of these sort of informations in these ancient sources when we look at that. The question is, how do we model this? How do we get this out of these documents so that we can study it on a large scale with big data? So we can hopefully be able to, study these details. But the point with network science is also that you can study the very small details, but you can study it on different scales and build it up until you arrive at something that hopefully will give you more universal patterns that you can detach from accumulating all of these, building up many of these different very detailed information. So basically, I am using network science to study socioeconomic systems, human behavior. I'm interested in how the state is involved in a local level. Different things, for example, with tax use and taxation and land use, but also in how the ancient Egyptians used writing and how we need to think about that when we are using written sources. We need to think about what the writing was for, what did they put in there of information, and how does that affect the picture that we have, for example. So I'm assuming in my research that social agents typically interact in many different ways. Economic transactions happen in a lot of these sources. One core concept of network science is that relationships matter. It matters who you know and how your abilities might improve from that and so on. I'm also assuming that human behavior is not random. We follow different patterns. They might be more or less individual, but there's systems to it that are, flexible and but it's not random. Multiple systems are at play at once. So we're driving all different sorts of relations that play in, and one system might have a stronger affection at one situation than the other, but also that the written record is biased. And all these sort of things I'm trying to kind of take in as a theoretical framework for studying this. But basically, going then into practice, taking the theory to practice, I'm building two different types of networks, and we'll see many examples of this in a second. But just to already introduce them now, in order to ask questions and research these sort of things, I'm building one type of network that you see up here, where all of my dots represent individuals, and the lines and arrows that are drawn between them represent the social and economic relationships that the texts tell me that they were involved in, that they shared. So I'm linking pairs of people if I learn something about how they know each other and how they are interacting. The other type is what is called an affiliation network. So the simple image here, you have, like in the one on top, you have a light green and dark green, and this is what I usually use as the color coding for men and women, just to show that you can show these sort of things already here. For the bottom part, the color distinguishes different types of nodes. So we call them the dots nodes and the lines of the relationships edges, just in case I use these words you might know. So here we have two different types of social entities we are interested in. The blue ones here are all people, but the red one is the text itself. Because with network science, you can conceptualize almost anything as a network. Anything where there are entities and they relate somehow, right? So the first one is easier to grasp because it's all human and they relate with kinship and loan activities, sales, and so on. But we can also use network science to model how attackers relate to the people mentioned in it. So it's basically an affiliation network or an accusation network where we link all of the people mentioned in a document to a node representing the document. And then we can feed all sorts of information in there to analyze that. But yeah, just to introduce these types. So I think also last time in these meetings, you had a bit of an introduction to network science, where I think Kajsa and Heidi and so also talked about social network analysis. So I don't know if you've heard much of it before, but I thought just to make sure that everyone is kind of on the same line here, I'll start with just a simple, completely made up example, just to show how the principle is, but also to give you an idea of what network data looks like, what sort of information do we actually record and how do we organize that. So just as an example, in order to make a social network and to be able to analyze that, you need two different things. You need information on the studied entities, so the nodes, and you need information on how these dots are linked, right? So we have to make two different lists. Like, there's many ways to do it, but I usually work with this with node list and edge list, so this is all we will talk about today, not to confuse more than it is. But for the node list, you need to have a personal ID for all of the different dots. So every row here is a different dot. And then you usually would have, if you have a social network with people, you would usually need to have at least their name, for example, so that you know which dot is which person. But basically you can add columns with whatever sort of information you want to there. So here are just two examples of things you might be interested in, but it could be anything that you have in your data and that is interesting for your questions. And you just basically add those to it, attributing each of these dots, and then that's part of the network. So we can represent that as 4 dots in this case. Then we need information on how to link them. So we write a separate edge list. So here you need 2 columns to tell which is the source and the target. So this basically needs to have the same IDs as in the node ID to tell the software that we will use which dots we are to link. And then you add, again, columns with whatever information on the relationship you are interested in. And you have. Once we have that, we can add the links to that. So here we have an example just of a married couple with 2 kids. Right, so we have a relationship for the marriage. We have parent-child relations from both parents to each of the 2 kids. And then we can draw a sibling line between the kids as well. So dots 3 and 4. And then once we add to this, let's say that we learn something about Eva's parents, so dots 2 here. We can simply add that to the node list and add the relationships to the add list, and then we can model that as well. Let's say we learn something now about the friends of the kids. So we add that to the node and edge lists, and we model it in the network. And this is how we can kind of build the network in a bottom-up approach. Are you with me? Good. Okay, so let's go to an example from my research. So this is from my ongoing research, where I'm studying the Sinon archive, it's called. So we'll have a look at a contract that was written up in Bertha in the land of Ammon. So we are in Transjordan. So it's written in the Levant outside of Egypt. but it's written between agents from Egypt and local agents. So the seller is local. He's Nicanor, who is working for Tobias, who is the ruler in the area. And the buyer is Sinon, who is the main owner of the archive that I'm studying, who is acting on behalf of Apollonius. And Apollonius is the financial minister of Ptolemy II. So this is a really, really important person. He's the financial minister of Egypt in the early Ptolemaic period. And basically, you know, just before we go more into detail with the text, just to introduce the archive. So this is part of a huge archive, the largest archive that has survived from ancient Egypt. It was unearthed in Philadelphia in the Fayum Oasis. So you see that on the map up in the corner here with the red dot representing the town. And today we know about 1,845 papyri from this one archive. So it's a huge archive in Egyptological standards. Most of the texts are Greek, but there's also some Demotic and bilingual texts of papyri that has both Greek and Demotic writing. And we have mostly letters and documentary sources, very few literary texts. And the very important thing is that even if there's so many texts, they cover only a period of about 35 years. So we have tons of information from this quick period of time under Ptolemy's the second and third. So if we go to the text, we can see that this is a translation by Cherekova, and it reads, in the 27th year of the reign of Ptolemy, son of Ptolemy, and his son Ptolemy, the priest of Alexandria and of the gods of Delphi, and the Kanethos of Arsinoe Philadelphos, being those in office in Alexandria, in the month Sanithos, at Biata of the Amanites. And then the contract proper starts now. Nicanor, son of Xenocles, Cnidian, in the service of Tobias, sold to Sinon, son of Agreophon, Caunian, in the service of Apollonius the Diocetes, a Sidonian girl named Pragis, about 7 years of age, for 50 drachmae. Guarantor, he lost the name, but is son of Ananias, Persian of the troops of Tobias, cleric. And then we have the witness lists, where we have different people mentioned with their ethnic as well. And then on the back, it's written that it's a deed of sale of a girl. So in order to make that network, we need to first create a list of people in it. So here I've highlighted all of the people that I've modeled in this network. And then as soon as we have that, very simply, actually, if we don't need more information, we can very simply write a list of these people, give them IDs to represent who is, namesakes and who is individual people, and then create a model like this. So this is a simple two-mode network of this text, where you have the text dot, which is the red one in the middle, and then one purple or pink dot for each of the people mentioned in this document. So as soon as we have these, if we want to make these into personal networks of just people related by actual social and economic relationships, the next step that I do is that reading the documents in translation, I record manually information on all of the relationships that I learned from it. So reading this document, for example, we have a lot of close kin relations, so family members. We have several hierarchical relationships of somebody having a superior that's named as part of their identification or the way that the contract is written up. We have some information on colleagues. We can record a sale. We have evidence of collaboration, and we have several service ties. And once we then write these edge lists to represent all of this as a network, we end up with something, funny looking like this. But it's useful also for one text. But of course, the main idea of this is that we don't do it for one text; we do it for many, and it makes sense if there are people that are mentioned, and we know it's the same person mentioned in more than one document, of course, because that's how we don't end up with like a ton of these small blobs, but where we actually end up with an interesting picture where the texts are merged by the people that they share. So this is an example of the network as it looks when we add 35 more documents to this. So the one that we looked at is from the very early parts of the archive. And here we have a network of 36 of the early documents. Well, actually in this case only 25, because only the texts that do mention at least 2 people that can be linked by a relationship are represented in here. So the sources behind this is 36 documents, but only 25 of them have at least one relationship recorded. But anyway. So once we do this, we end up with a more interesting picture. And what is very characteristic here, and we'll see again and again, is that you have all of these different small dots or groups that cannot be connected to the rest because we don't know who these people are or how they relate to the rest of them. But what I see again and again and again and again in my networks of ancient documents is that very soon we start to have this formation of one big group where a lot of people are merged into that. And this is usually the part that I'm then very interested in, because that's informed by many different written sources at the same time. But this is the area where the text that we looked at is positioned now. So not so much in the top area here, but basically the bottom part here, and including Lena and Apollonius, the archive owner and the financial minister. Yeah, and just to show you, this is again the text that we looked at the very beginning. This letter about the cloth for mattress wrapping. And if we look at this one as well, this is actually part over here. So you see that this document can be linked to the other document, even if one of them is written in the Delta area from Naucratis, sending cloth to Alexandria, to the capital, all within Egypt. And this other one is written up in the Levant. But they still are linked by the people that are involved in these activities. So you kind of tie these areas together with that. And to say that these are 2 texts, as an example, that are from 2 consecutive years. So one is written in 259 and one in 258 BCE. And we're looking at a network that was created from studying 36 of the earliest documents that span a total of 6 years. But to remind you, the archive has 1,845 documents spanning 35 years. So when this keeps, building up in this, we have a wonderful source material to look at with that, eventually that becomes a reality. And in this early period, Sinan, the archive owner, is traveling around in the Levant, working as the private agent of the financial minister of Apollonius. So what I'm also very interested in the research that I do here is to try and take these networks to the next step, because I'll talk about Papyrus later on, which is one specific site in Egypt that I studied before. But that's all from documents from one specific time period and one specific, spanning about 100 years, but from one specific town in that area and some of the cities around it. It is centered on that area. Whereas in this archive, we get information from so many different areas. And I'm very interested in trying to take that, geographical aspect into the network somehow. So if we look at this text as well, this contract with the sale of the slave girl, we see that we have also places mentioned. But if we look at places mentioned as places, we only have these 3 attested. But in these documents, places are very often referred to as describing things or animals or people as well. So if we take those into consideration as well, we do get quite a lot of geographical information from this. And extracting those, we could, do the same and make a 2-mode network of places attested in the document. Or we could merge it with the people and arrive at a 3-mode network where we have texts mentioning people and places. And again, we can zoom that out to this case study of the 36 early documents. So here we have now, red dots are the texts, the purple ones are the people, the places, and the pink ones are the people. And what is really interesting is that, once you get this into the software, you can feed it, you have fed it with all of this information, so you can play around with that. But what network science also brings is that it comes with a range of formal tools that you can apply to these network strategies to measure the network and to study the structure in formal manners. So, for example, in what I'm finding very useful for these sort of networks is to look at out-degree centrality. So this is the measure of the importance of a node. And there's different centrality concepts, but if we look at out-degree, that basically counts how many arrows is pointing away from a node. Because in these networks, all of my relationships have a direction. I always direct them from the text to a person or place mentioned in it. And because of this, I can have the software calculate the out degree centrality of the node to quickly show me a list of the top 5 ranking, as we see here, which in this case will give me very easily the text that mentioned the most people and places. And perhaps not so surprisingly, you see that 4 of the 5 on this list are accounts, which makes sense when we look at this corpus, like the early corpus that I studied here. But number 2 here on the list, the second highest in terms of out degree, is the contract that we just looked at. And of course, that makes sense when we think about the text and the fact that it has so many witnesses, for example, mentioned underneath it. It mentions a lot of people. But yeah. Reversely, we can calculate the in degree centrality, which then would count the number of arrows pointing towards the node. So this then can be used to very quickly see which people and places are mentioned the most. And this might become more interesting, right? Because this is not, from looking at the text, we can relatively easily see if it mentions a lot or a few people and places. But once we can take this perspective and we can say, okay, I'm interested in this person, and then have the network show us exactly which texts this person is affected in and how many that are. So if we again get this list here, we then have the people. So we have people that we would expect also, Sinon, Apollonius, and Tobias, for example, very high up here, but also a few other people that are ship captains or for whatever reason important in the network. And then we always have to go back to the sources, of course, to figure out, why is this person actually the highest ranking here. But what I wanted to show you here is that when we do this also, the 5th place is shared with a place, Chios. And this is located all the way over here, as you see. So basically, the texts were found down here. Apollonius and Sinon has their power base or the household in Alexandria at the moment. They're traveling around here in the Levant, and this is the most frequently mentioned place in here. So when we then go back to the sources and we look at when this place is, like now, the network software has kind of showed us interest in this place, and then we can go back to the sources and figure out, is this actually an interesting place? And in this case, we find that it's almost exclusively referring to things. So specifically jars, walnut, and cheese from Chios, but from many different texts. This is the sort of thing that, as soon as you blow it up like this, you see things that it's very likely that you would miss by other methods. But yeah, I'm almost finished with what I wanted to say with the Sinon archive, but I just wanted to show you at the end here that this is a visualization of how the current state of the dataset is. So this is basically people mentioned in texts, but in all of the texts, 1,845 documents, but taken as it is from Trismegistus. So you have the logos of it up here. So this is a wonderful database for studying ancient sources that has metadata on many different things, but also then lists of people that are mentioned in these documents. And this is what I can, take those and start from there and have that as my cryptographical background. And then as I'm reading through the documents to make these interpersonal relationships of only people, I'm adding to this and building, feeding in much more information of what I'm interested in and changing and adding people that aren't in the list and so on. But this is showing basically how that looks. And the large red dots are the 36 early documents that we looked at now. So we must remember that unnamed people and places and groups are only recorded for these early documents. So the picture will change. But we already can see, the general picture and what I expect that we will arrive at, a different picture when you start looking down into the details of this network. But the overall structure, I think, is already pretty evident here. So again, we have this really big blob with most people and texts mentioned in this wonderful archive, actually connecting to one another. So yeah, still a way to go, but hopefully we'll get there. So I wanted to show you also a few examples of the research that I already continued from my PhD. So just to, this is, we already see a bit of how we can bring this to life, but this is a study that's basically done. So in order to see how we can start to bring the life about, we have a bigger data set if we look at this data set as well. So we'll, in a second, look at this document, but before that, I want to give you a little bit of contextualization again. So we're moving now to Tyrus in Upper Egypt, located about 28 kilometers south of Thebes. So we're in this dot here. So before we were in Philadelphia up here, and now we're down here. We also moved about a century later in time And this is how it looks on the ground now with Google Earth. So basically, this whole area here is referred to as Gebelein, which refers to these two mountains in the area here. And you have the Nile running here, so we are west of the Nile. And then the town that I've been studying, it is a small town and a military camp, would have been located here on the top and western slope of this mountain, and also like spreading into the fields that go around here. But basically, this is the area that we're looking at for this part. So there is a map that has been published also from the Italian missions that excavated here in 1910 and 11. But if you go there today and you stand on the side, this is basically what you see. So this is where the larger part of the town would have been located. And just to show you, if you look here on the map, this here is the building that you see at the corner up there. So we're basically standing over here, looking in this direction at where the town would have been. So today there's not much left. The modern town is growing into that, and you have, goats running around and crushing mud brick by the hour. But when you walk around there, you still see on the ground all of these potsherds and mud bricks and so lying around. We also have some traces of walls that are still standing and sticking up from the ground, like here. But the wonderful thing, and what's most important for my approach, is that we have tons of text from papyrus as well. So modern scholars have reconstructed 21 archives from this site, and this is what I studied for my PhD. These 21 archives of texts preserved on papyrus, on ostraka, and on wooden tablet. And this is here. I have this also here, so if you want, I can send them around in case you are interested in flipping in them, or we can show them afterwards, but I'll give them to you guys. But yeah, basically, just to give you an example from this. So this is, again, a contract, but it's a different one. It's regarding the sale of land, of real estate, or property. So it's a contract written in Demotic, so this late stage of the Egyptian language, but then it has also a Greek text receipt attached to it. And the Greek text receipt, you can see, was written a few months later. So the contract itself is written on 14th of July, 140 BCE, and the receipt only in August or September 139. So this is where, the people that buy the real estate have to then later go to a Greek edition of the Royal Bank to pay the tax fee for the property that they have bought. So this is confirming that the sale then is not, a fake sale or a mortgage or so, but it's a sale that actually took place because they did actually pay the sales tax. And it's a wonderful document because, as you can see, it's quite fragmented, as most of the documents that we are working with. But it's part of a family archive from this site. It is also part of a lawsuit dossier that's part of that family archive. So it means that there's a group of documents that were collected because they ended up in court fighting over different things. So there's a lot of documentation, and this means that we know this case very well, we know these people very well, and therefore we can reconstruct a lot of the information that is lost in the papyrus itself from the other document. And if we again model this as networks, so this is what you've seen before now with the text and the people in it. Here with the green one representing the Greek part of the contract, and the blue lines representing or showing which people are mentioned in the Demotic part of it. And we can reconstruct that again as an interpersonal network of only people. And here we see very clearly that we have all of the red notes are classified by me as social relations, and then the blue ones are economic relations. And we can see here basically how this man has sold this property earlier to this woman. And at this current stage in the contract, we learn that this woman is selling it to her daughter. And she's also saying that this is the property of which your sister owns half. So this is the sister here. So they have a collaboration in that they share this property basically. But yeah, this is the sort of details that go into it. And again, if we blow that up and we do it on a much larger scale, we get to say much more. So this is basically showing the network that represents this data set of 428 documents. And then this interpersonal network of only people with social and economic relations based on this corpus. So this is the network model that I used as the basis to study this community. This is my community network, so to say. And again, we see what we saw before, a really big part of these people are interconnected in one big block in the middle. So just to show you a bit of what the network perspective then can do. So once we arrive at a network model like this, which, you know, a big part of the job is getting here, but then once we get here, we can do wonderful things to this data set. So in particular, what is useful, or what I find really useful, is that you can study this data set from multiple scales. So if we zoom out and study it in a big scale like this, we are basically looking at the community as it is reflected in the written sources. But we can also separate different subgroups from here, and these could be based on, you know, asking the software to show us only the women, hide all of the men. It could be based on profession, so we could study, you know, only the scribes or only the priests and so on. We could look at specific families if we have coded data in there to link them to the family or to a specific family archive. We can split it up again. Or we can do this thing of using the network software to measure the network and then isolate subgroups based on these results of the network measure. So for example, to say that, okay, we measure the betweenness centrality, which is a centrality measure that counts how often a specific person appears on the shortest path between other nodes. So a lot of these nodes will have several different people in between, and they're not linked directly to one another. And then you count how many people you need to go through to get to that other person. So people with high betweenness centrality will be the people that are functioning as brokers or gateways between different people here. And if we do that, we can, for example, filter the network to say that we're interested only in the top 50 people and the people that they relate to, and then filter it in that sense. We can also zoom very far in and look at individuals, and we'll end with that today to get to know one of the people better. But for most of the studies that I did, you know, it's interesting to see how the whole network looks. But for most of it, I'm mostly interested in that part that we have in the middle here. So just to give you an example, once we then isolate this part, which is called the core component, of which, you know, everyone is linked to somebody else. But then once we have that in a separate, you know, workspace, we can look at it, for example, also from the perspective of the relationships. So here I filter the network to say, okay, I want to see everyone that is part of this big area in the middle here. But once I have that, I want to see only the close kin relationships. So only the really tight family ties, family relationships, and to see how that looks in the network. And then if we do the same, but we hide the kinships, but then we look at the neighbors, we can see, you know, how different the structure is in this. It's not so easy to see here, perhaps, because here we still have the nodes all positioned as they are when all of the different types of relationships are in there. But if we split that, we run what is called the layout algorithm, which is basically there's different ways that you can tell the software to organize the nodes. So you can have it organize everything on a circle, for example, or what I use very often is these force-driven algorithms that tells the software that nodes that are connected are supposed to be pulled and positioned close together, but the nodes that are not connected should be pushed apart. And that means that you end up with this abstract, you know, space because of these two forces that are in play. So if you have a relationship, you're close. If you don't, you pull out. And that's what kind of spreads out the relationship. So it's interesting to see how it is in the position that they are. But then if we rerun this layout algorithm with only this data set in there, we get very different pictures. And then we can see that again, we have the similar situation where a lot of, like a big part of these are all interconnected in one group in both cases. But there's quite a lot of difference, as you can see already, in the structure of the kinship network compared to the structure of the neighbor network, which is really tight. And everything is really, really close together, right? And again, we have to remember here, of course, the nature of the sources, because the neighbors, very often I learn information on them from these sort of sales contracts that has to do with real estate. And the way that the property that is being sold, this is another interesting part, is that the way that they sell real estate is often in pieces, right? So you don't have one owner of a certain field, but you have split it among different people. So you can have a sales contract that regards, 1/5 of that part in the southern corner of that field. So you have a really, really complex system of who owns what in a place like this. But how you then identify the plot is usually by naming the neighbor to each side. So you say what is in the north, what is in the east, what is in the south, what is in the west. And these can be rivers or roads or so, but very often the neighbors are the house of this guy or the field of that guy. So this is, of course, a big part of why the network structure looked as it is. And this is part of what we need to remember when we then try to analyze these data sets. But it still, teaches us something to be able to play with the data in this sense. Just to give one other example of how we can filter the network. So again, we start with this huge community network. But let's say we are interested in loan activities, and we have that huge network, and we have information on relationships relating to loans. We can isolate those, again, rerun the algorithm to have it position it according to only this part of the data set. And if we do that, we see that here we have, again, one group that is slightly bigger, but it's not as clear here. So here we have a different situation where we have 3 different groups. But in each of them, we have specifically one person that has a lot of links to a lot of different people. And then there's something attached to that, right? So we have a very different situation from that. And then, from there, we go back to the sources, and now our attention has been drawn to these 3 people, perhaps. And then we can go back and we can compare, their stories and their activities to see what's going on here. If we're onto something that is a more universal trend, or if it's by chance, to see what's going on here. But I thought the last thing that I will show you as an example here is that we will have a look at her, Apollonio alias Senmontes, who's been highlighted a lot before as well, but nevertheless is an interesting case for this. So basically, if we then, if we want to study all 3 of them, now we will only look at her, but I basically would do the same for all of them and then compare and see what's going on there. But if we look at her, we have now been shown this one woman that is interesting from the network perspective, right? So then we go back to the sources. We can again use the network to ask, show me all of the documents that she's tested in, and then go from there as well. But basically, we can then gather different sort of information on her and see how that fits with the network and where she's positioned in it. So just to give you a couple of things, we see that the papyrus material in general covers a period of about 100 years. And she is active in time slots 1 to 3, what I call them, but basically towards the middle period of the time that I'm studying her. And she is the oldest child. So if we look at the genealogy here, she has sisters here. So I use this color again for the women and for the men here. So these are her sisters. We learned that she married only once. So she's married to Doidon, who was a Greek officer who moved to the town, and together they had 5 daughters. And she's then also functioning as a stepmother of Doidon's son from a previous marriage. So she's married only one and has a lot of women directly tied to her in the family tree. But if we then look at where she is in the network, so here we have zoomed back out to this community network, but still looking only at the core, only at the big blob of the network that has all of the data from all of the texts about the people. And the red dot that you see over here, this is the position of Apollonia. So you can see already that she has a quite interesting position in the network itself. She's not positioned very much towards the center or so, but you can see that she still has a very important structure in where she is. I don't know if you can see the webs also, but they're coming from all different sources and areas and kind of tying into her. But if we want to see her more closely, of course, we can zoom in here. So you see better the net here, and can kind of see all of the different activities when we are looking not only at loans, but all of the information that we have learned on her from these texts. And so this is just a screenshot of how it is working in the software that I'm using called Getty. And basically there, it's a very interactive interface. So if you move your mouse over her, for example, it will kind of make all of the others hide a bit and then light up all of the relationships involved in them. So a lot of the network analysis, of course, happens in the software. And this is a wonderful place to work and to play with the data. But it gives you all sorts of different things that you can do. And for example, if we're interested in her, an obvious thing is to go and use this function here with the ego network and type in her personal ID to say, okay, I want to see a network that has her at the center. I want to see her circle, her immediate connections in this network. So you can just type that in there and press filter, and then at the blink of an eye, you can either color off that, make the node that she has a direct link to bigger and color them by female or male distinction or unknown, or you can isolate that and bring that out as a separate network and then again rerun the algorithm. So this network over here basically is showing us how the network of Apollonias with only the people that are directly linked to her by a certain economic relation. I'm pulling this whole room apart. I'm sorry about this. Good. And once we have that, so here we see colors of the edges representing different types of relationships. But in this one here, I basically split it into the two major categories that I work with of social and economic relations. So we have the social relations on top, the red ones, and the visualization of the economic types in the bottom. So already from looking at this personal network, we can say several things, and by comparing her ego network to the ego network of, for example, the other two people very active in loan activities, we can start to compare and to see different stories and to, get to know her and get to know the other people and start to see, different ways that people would strategize, how they would, act and how they seem to increase their wealth by different strategies and so on, by looking at these different ego networks in comparison. And some of the things that we see by looking at her network is that she has a lot of women in her network. So there's just over 40% of the nodes that she's directly tied to are women. Makes sense when we saw the genealogy, right? Where she has so many sisters and daughters. And especially because we learned that she has a lot of ties, not only kinship ties, but also economic ties to her family members. But we see that she has a lot. So there's just over 40% women here. And it's not shown here, but what I also did was to kind of zoom this out and say, okay, show me the ego network of this woman, but not only with the direct relations. I want one circle out. I want the friends of the friends as well. Right? So you have the people that are directly tied to her and the people that are directly tied to them again. And if we do that, the number of women drops to, I think, about 20% or so, which is more usual. But in most of the networks that I studied, there seems to be a tendency that it's about 15% of the people are female. So it's still relatively high here. We see also that there's a lot of economic activities compared to what we see from a lot of the other networks that I studied from this perspective. And we see that the family is really, really tightly knit in this. So it's, result of how they use written sources, for example, and so on. There's many things coming into play here. But the family is really tightly knit, so that you see that the people that have social relations do also exclusively, I think all of them have also economic ties and quite a lot to them, both to each other and to her and so on. And they often collaborate in economic matters, for example, they sell things together, or they take loans together, or they make complaints together, and so on. And importantly, this also includes her stepson from the previous marriage. He has very tight connections to her part of the family as well, in this sense. And in terms of like the structural understanding of this network, so you see here that she is the spider in the middle of this web, but it's always interesting to see then what happens to this network if you take out the person of interest. And so if we try to take out Apollonia, we see that this network that is now all tied together into one relationship like this, as soon as we take her out, we get 12 different groups one of which is a bit bigger, but still there's 12 different groups. So we see that she really holds a structurally important position in this network. And again, by going deeper in and seeing who are actually these people that are in this network, how do they relate to her otherwise? A big part of this is that she has people from her own family basically positioned on one side here. So the part over here is largely her own family from before, and this is largely the family that she has with Triton. So these are their daughters and so as well. And then you have people from the community elsewhere, but you have these two big family groups. And once you take her out, most of these links between these parts of the family disappear. And so actually that these groups are only linked by, I think, Buetos, I think it's called. He's a strategos and strategos, who both family groups make complaints to. But that's rather by chance that that link still exists there. So you see that she's very important for that part. Another part is, of course, that she's so active in these loan activities, because as we saw in that network before, if you remember, you had her node, and then you had all of these different ones that were not linked to anyone else. And this is because Apollonia clearly is maximizing her income by functioning as a creditor in this community. And she's giving loan to a total of 16 people, as far as we learned from these documents. And most of them have no known social relation to her at all, which means that they're part of this network here, but once you take her out, she has no link to the rest of the people here. They're not, as we know, colleagues of her husband or anything like this. Yeah, and then, you know, you study that from the network perspective, but if you list all of these, so here is a list of all of the relationships that she has to people directly. But we can also do that to see how the people she relates to relate to one another. So this is the second list here. And what is also worth noticing for her is that, so what we have up here is more common that you have quite a lot of labor ties also as part of the social relations. And for the other people active in loan activities that we seem interesting as well, they are quite active in labor ties and buying and selling property and so as well. But Apollonia has exclusively social relations that has to do with kinship ties. Nothing at all, no information about her owning real estate or having neighbor relations or so at all. And this is again something that kind of sets her apart and seems to be something that, you know, with this big amount of data on her and many texts mentioning her, seems more to be perhaps a choice from her side that she's not involved in these things. She does the loans and that's it. Whereas we see with other people that there's much more of a mixed strategy. Yeah, so just to conclude, I hope that you've gotten an impression of how Egyptologists can also use methods of network science to try and get closer to the ancient Egyptians and their way of life. But I want to end with just the warning on some of the challenges that comes with methods. So one thing is that, of course, if you want to do this sort of really, really detailed analysis, it's really time consuming. So a lot of network studies, you know, there's a lot of methods and things that you can do where you can get a data set much more quickly and do many things to that as well. But with this sort of research that I show you here, it's really time consuming to build up the data set. Either way, you have to, when you start looking into network science, you have to spend quite a lot of time learning theories and methods that come with that field and figuring out how to build a network. And that often then comes with a lot of challenges working with the ancient sources, with, you know, different publications and the fragments in the documentations, and figuring out if somebody with that is named Horus is the same as a Horus mentioned in a different document, or if they're not. You know, there's all of these different questions that come into play with the written sources as well. And then once you finally arrive at the network model, you still need to be able to identify the right set of tools to study it with, the right measurements and the right perspective to answer the questions that you are trying to ask with these methods. And then you need to learn how to use those tools and interpret the results that come from it, where again you have to go back and think about, you know, how the Egyptians used writing at the first place and these things. But a big challenge is also how to share the outcome, because so much of the network analysis happens when you play around in the network software, right? So how to share that in more traditional publications and so is a really big question as well, and for different audiences that might not be so familiar with the method. But if you want to go down that path and try these things out, I think network perspectives can offer a lot to Egyptological studies as well. So, you know, one is this playful and interactive software. I use Gephi, as mentioned. It's written up here if you're interested in it, but there's many different network softwares and tools available out there, and many of those are freely available. If you end up building a database like I do, with a lot of detailed information about the people and the places and how they relate to one another, you also find that you end up with a really useful multifunctional database that you can use for different things than network analysis as well. So building the data set in itself is a big resource. And then taking that relational perspective and contextualizing everything so that you can see these people by, you know, zooming in on a person and then zooming back up to see the immediate surroundings, and then zooming back in and zooming out to something else, and then looking at it from the whole perspective of the community and so on. It gives a very good way of contextualizing things that you can, you know, filter in all of these different ways, and with a click of a mouse move from, you know, one specific type of document to one specific person or so on. So yeah, multi-scale analysis, this mixed method approach where you do the networks, but you don't do the network analysis, of course, in isolation. It goes alongside more traditional methods, and you need those to be able to do network analysis that makes sense, to be able to interpret the material in a meaningful way. And especially if it's built bottom up like this, you have that empirical ground that then allows you to tell really, really detailed stories about the lives of some of these people. Or to look at the big picture and see, okay, so what are the big trends that we can see from studying big data, or what we as Egyptologists at least we call big data. But then also there's so much happening in between there where you can look at different levels and different parts of the structure. So yeah, I hope I have, you know, managed to show you a little bit of what it can do at least and raise some interest.